Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. Once again, I have my ever-present perennial guest, Jeff Nyquist. Jeff Nyquist is a author of a variety of books, including Origins of the Fourth World War, The Fool and His Enemy, and many, many other books. He has his own blog, jrnyquist.blog. He's an expert on national security related issues. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Nevin?
Good, 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 very good. Just want to go over a couple of brief updates before we start the interview. Some brief date updates on the Populist Patriot. Moving forward, this is going to be a guest-driven interview program. I'm not going to be doing as many live streams anymore, both because of time constraints, as well as also I plan on I'm already doing and been doing for the past couple of months research for some major papers and essays I'll be writing and posting on a paid subscription newsletter on Substack. It's going to be what I hope excellent commentary. Those of you who are familiar with my writings, both essays that have been published elsewhere as well as books, you're going to get a lot of excellent analysis that you're not necessarily going to find elsewhere, even on the internet. And I encourage you to, once the Substack newsletter is launched, to subscribe to it. It's not going to be anything super expensive. I'm thinking $5 or $10 a month. For now on, we're going to be having just guests on this program, and we're going to tap their expertise. We're obviously we're blessed with Jeff's expertise and willingness to come on this program on a semi-regular basis. But we also have other individuals like retired military officer David Pine. I'm working on some interviews with the YouTuber Counterpoints, but unfortunately he's down in Florida, and he went through the horrible Hurricane Ian. So we hope and pray for the people that have been devastated by Hurricane Ian, that they will get through this as best as they can. And we have other guests in mind that I'm trying to get on the program with some success. So without further ado, Jeff, we know you're not rooting and tooting for Mr. Putin, who's going a shooting. What is going on with him? Because, he made this speech, usually has his truculent moments. We have Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, which are Soviet-style states, being annexed. We were just discussing that September 21st news article on Babel.ua that its title, Xi Jinping urged the Chinese military to prepare for a real combat. He emphasized it is necessary to understand the new situation and requirements, focus on preparing for war, have the courage to explore and innovate. And this was a story, dateline September 21st, 2022, and this was after his summit meeting with Vladimir Putin. What's going on?
Well, after Putin and Xi met in February 4th and announced their unlimited partnership, you had Putin invade Ukraine. Now they met again in Samarkand here just, was it a week before last, so many days ago. They then suddenly Putin announces a mobilization, annexes 4 oblasts of Ukraine, declares that all their citizens are now Russians forever, and basically implies that he'll use nuclear weapons to keep those people in his chicken coop of peoples. He's going to force people to lay eggs for him, I guess. He killed the goose that laid the golden egg, so he's got to find a bunch of chickens to make up for it. But Putin is trying to treat people as his chattel or his farm animals, and he's going to own them. And he's claiming they voted for him to be Russians. Let me ask you, from everything you know, Nevin, do you think there's any chance that 87% of the people in any of those provinces or oblasts belonging formerly part of the sovereign state of Ukraine voted to be part of Russia. Do you believe that that was an honest vote?
87% is usually a pretty suspicious number. It's like those 99.9% plebiscites. I mean, we don't know. I mean, we know that the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republics are actual communist states. They have Stalinist structures. They're pretty open about that. So I think that has to be treated with a healthy dose of skepticism. Yes, even though there are quite a bit of ethnic Russians there, you have to question that really and
Well,
truly.
my
You have to
understanding
really,
is the
you have to question it.
yeah,
So
my
no, I
understanding
don't
is
think.
the Russian soldiers in those oblasts voted.
Well, of course, and they're more than
You
likely
know,
for the.
and do you think all the Ukrainians, but how many Ukrainians now? We've got, I think, isn't it more than 2 million? Isn't it close to 3 million Ukrainians have fled abroad? And many of the Ukrainians who have fled are from those areas. So
Oh,
I don't
there you
think
go.
they voted, right?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think they voted absentee either.
And maybe the 100,000 Ukrainians that were carried off in servitude into Russia for goodness knows, to be put in camps. I don't think they voted either.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so either. And yeah, that was going to be a point that I was going to bring up for you for your knowledge, because you keep up with us on a regular basis, is how fair really are these elections? I mean, we're not talking about classically liberal states here where there's secret ballot and whatnot, where you have freedom of the press, freedom of speech and whatnot, and a free economy. So yeah, that kind of, you answered kind of like, you anticipated my question.
It's very interesting. Russia, you had the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and Putin talked about that in his speech this morning. You have the old Soviet Union, a state that had really kind of strict requirements, ideology. People had to conform to a certain kind of to the Communist Party's rules. Then you had that go away, and they allowed certain freedom of speech for some years. And then Putin came in and started slowly moving everything back, back to the USSR. And what's really interesting is Putin made this fascinating statement in his speech. I want to read this this morning. This is his, saying that these four provinces, basically oblasts of Ukraine, are now Russian territory. He said he complained that in 1991 at Belovej Forest, without asking the will of the common citizens, right? Suddenly he's a Democrat. Representatives of the then party elites of the USSR decided to destroy the USSR, and people suddenly found themselves cut off from their motherland. This tore apart and dismembered our nation, becoming a national catastrophe. Wow. He's calling the Soviet Union his nation. Our nation is really the Soviet Union. He's saying this right then. And of course, he bemoans the fall of the Soviet Union once again, and, talks about, putting something back together again. And then he says, well, the Soviet Union, had its problems, but, right? And so then he says that the leaders of the USSR did not fully realize what they were doing and what consequences this would inevitably lead to in the end. Freedom, maybe? And freedom for Ukraine? But this is no longer important. And then I want to ask, so why did you mention it? And so it's a very curious speech. And then he talks, instead about the USSR, the great historical Russia, as if someone who considers the USSR their country and bemoans its dismemberment could consider himself a great Russian. And that's a contradiction, isn't it, Nevin?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean, he's a part of the Soviet system. He still has not let go or shed any of his Soviet culture. So it's really not surprising. I'm not, color me unsurprised when I looked at snippets of this speech in preparation of this interview. It's the standard boilerplate that he's given for many, many years, even
Well,
when we're.
and it's very Soviet because he uses vague or slightly, softened Leninist terminology. For example, he says, I want the Kiev authorities and their real masters in the West to hear me so that they remember this. People living in Luhansk and Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporozhye are becoming our citizens forever, right? We call on the Kiev regime to immediately end hostilities, end the war they unleashed back in 2014, and return to the negotiating table. Just lies. It's so Soviet. And he says he's not going to discuss ever giving anything back that he's taken. And about the Nordstream gas leak, right?
Mhm.
I mean, NATO has now said that this was an attack on the gas pipeline. They're saying the nation state actor did it. And here's what Putin said about it. Sanctions were not enough for the Anglo-Saxons. Um, they moved they moved on to sabotage. It is hard to believe, but it is a fact that they organized the blasts on the Nord Stream international gas pipelines, which run along the bottom of the Baltic Sea. It is clear to everyone who benefits from this. Well, I beg to differ. How do the Anglo-Saxons benefit from this? First of all, Germany has already decided, and a majority of Germans in a poll from the 9th of September, they've decided they're going to suffer through this winter. They're going to try to get through this without the Russian gas and oil, without the thing that they really need. And I heard a German Foreign Minister Baerbock say, we made a promise. I made a promise. She made it personal to the Ukrainian people. And we're going to pull, as you know, the German people, we're going to pull together to make sure all the German people make it through this. And we want Ukraine to make it through this. But my understanding is she had seen the massacre at, now I'm forgetting the place, the big massacre that happened that they found there in the spring when the retreat from Kiev began. Do you remember the name of the place?
I
The
do
town?
not, unfortunately, no.
Anyway, she'd seen that apparently, and that really turned her against Russia. And I think people are revolted at the fact that a country invades another country, annexes its territory, and then accuses the other country of starting the war. I mean, it's outrageous. It's really outrageous. Absolutely outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for him, and then he calls the West neo-colonial, and then talks about slavery. They've been colonialists since the Middle Ages, and he talked about slavery and genociding the Indians, and he brings up all this stuff, which is like has nothing to do with now.
What a standard Soviet boilerplate. It's
Yeah.
true or not, it's standard Soviet boilerplate.
Now I have a question for Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, because you say that those are Russian citizens because they once belonged to Russia. So does Moscow belong to Mongolia because it was once ruled by the Mongols? Where's your consistency, Mr. Putin? Where does Genghis Khan come into your argument? You're bringing up the Middle Ages. Good grief. You know, this nonsense, this mishmash of historical justifications to invade a country, to trample them down, to knock down their cities, to murder their citizens, to murder your own soldiers by neglect and abuse. I mean, the abuse of the Russian soldier. Oh my gosh, this is just so appalling. No wonder 265,000, well, it's bigger today, but a couple days ago, that was the number of young Russian men that have fled the Russian Federation to, nearly 100,000 to Kazakhstan, to Georgia, to Finland, to the Baltic states, those who had visas to European countries, to Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Why are they fleeing? Because they believe in the great Russia of Vladimir Putin? Those people are probably more Russian than Putin is. because at least they have the sense that they don't want to be the chattel of some communist overlord who wants to restore the Soviet Union. It's really outrageous. So he's basically saying, we're taking this, he's drawn a red line and saying, now we're going to use nuclear weapons. And what I fear he's going to do is, I don't think he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, because I think tactical nukes are more dirty than strategic ones, because I believe most of them are atomic, actually, weapons. And so they're fission, not fusion. So I think that they have thermobaric bombs. And I don't know if you've seen any of the footage from Ukrainian drones of the attacks that the Russians launched in May using thermobarics. Have you ever seen those?
I haven't seen them, but I have heard descriptions, and it's incredibly devastating, is basically what I heard. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, they have MLRS artillery that can deliver these things, and they'll drop them. There's the Ukrainian front line, and they'll drop 4 of them together, and they explode like bubbles. You see this shock wave, which can collapse large buildings. It can penetrate into bunkers and kill people. It can even kill people through the steel hull of a tank. These shock waves are so devastating. What it does is it's a vacuum bomb, basically. It sucks all the air out of the atmosphere, creates a giant gas bubble. Fire sucks up the oxygen, creates this devastating shock wave. It can have the power of a tactical nuke without the radiation. So this is the weapon, and I would not be surprised. I hope this is not true, but I would not be surprised if Ukraine does not come to the negotiation table, which they're not going to do. Zelensky has stated that. Not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory, that he's going to go after Kiev and maybe Lviv with these weapons. And it's technically only illegal to use those kind of weapons against civilians. Now, the thing that the out for Russia will be, and we'll watch for this and see, note if Russia publicly says, the people in Kiev need to leave the city, or the people in Lviv, or whatever city they name, have to leave the city because we're going to hit it. And that gets them out of it being a crime, because they can say, look, these are military targets. There's military infrastructure. There's command and control there. We have to hit it. And we just want to give the civilians a chance. And that way, of course, all the Ukrainians can't leave their cities. What if the Russians are bluffing, right? You can't. But I think that's what they might do, because they're preparing for the Russians are preparing to launch some kind of strike in Ukraine. I hope it won't be nuclear. I hope not. But your earlier quote talking about Xi Jinping making the statement, and Chinese officials have been talking about going to war with America. And I don't know if I discussed this with you, but sources in Southeast Asia, in the communist regimes of Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, have said that they were informed by the Chinese and Russians that both of these countries, China and Russia, are preparing for thunderous war against America in the not too distant future, and that was more than 2 years ago. So I think there's evidence that Russia and China are preparing for a larger war. Whether they have the nerve to do it or not, right? Nobody knows. You just see this military operation. They sighted the Chinese and Russian ships off of Alaska. Again, a military exercise in which Russian and Chinese ships are coming up to Alaska. What do you think that exercise is? It's the invasion of Alaska. No,
they're not going fishing.
No, warships don't go fishing. Not for those kind of fish. Maybe the fish with nuclear bombs underneath their gills, But it's no, it's very dangerous. I don't think, Nevin, that we have lived in such a dangerous time in our whole lives until now.
And what do you mentioned the pipeline? What do you make of that? You have people that tend to be more apologetic towards Russia or outrightly pro-Russian that are claiming it's the Ukrainian SBU, the secret services. They are blaming the United States. Then there are those that will say that it's Russia and as perhaps a staged provocation. What are your sources and analysis tell you about the explosions of the underwater Nordstream pipeline.
Well, right now, I don't have any sources, and I don't think nobody has any real information on who did this. But yet there are people all over the media and the net that are convinced that who did it, because it's somehow obvious who did it, right? So let me offer a few thoughts about the whodunit of it. Okay, let me be Columbo for a second. First of all, the one thing we can say is that you can't rule out that America did it, because America does really stupid things that hurt its own side.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always a possibility that our idiot in chief in the White House, that man who should never have been elected president of the United States, who said last winter, before Ukraine was invaded, that we would hit that pipeline if Ukraine was invaded, who probably says, half of the things he says, the White House officially takes back and says, no, the president misspoke. So we don't know what's serious and what's not coming out of that man's mouth. So I'll just lay that out there. Okay, you can't rule out the United States. I'd like to rule out the United States, but you can't rule it out.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, by the way,
fair enough.
right. But by the way, as I kind of pointed out before, it's not to America's benefit, because if we did that and it got discovered, it would destroy our relationship with the Germans, and the German people would turn on us. We would be defeated within our own alliance. We would lose respect, and we would lose trust. And the Germans have made this decision, this generous decision, to support Ukraine on their own, for us to cut the pipeline after they already stopped receiving. Well, that pipeline was never really operating. I think part of it was briefly. But for us to do that would just be rotten. And so it isn't to our advantage. And then look at Putin gets to make his speech today and claim that America attacked Russia because that pipeline is Russian infrastructure, which, by the way, could justify him attacking some of our infrastructure.
Correct.
So that's really scary. That's also dumb. People in glass houses with a lot of vulnerable infrastructure, which the United States has, should not be attacking Russia's infrastructure, especially an aggressive, violent country like Russia that is just attacks people without reason. You don't want to ever attack somebody who's really violent unless you're really expecting to be counterattacked, right? So
the United States does very stupid and can do very aggressive things.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
very stupid.
No
I mean, yeah. So, and I did not agree with the invasion of Iraq. Not that it taking down a very evil dictator wasn't a moral thing to do. It just was not really well thought out in terms of what it was going to do to the Middle East and the kind of position it would create for ourselves strategically. And that the fact is we didn't have any answers to solve the problems of that region, and we were just ending up handing Iraq over to Iran, because if we allow Iraq to become a democracy, it's majority Shiite, and that means the Shiites are under the Ayatollahs. So what have we done? It's really strategically stupid. So that being said, America shooting itself in the foot is like a regular deal. But the side that really benefits, that has the most to benefit, well, people could argue that Poland, who really doesn't want the Germans to go back on their deal, might do it. But then again, Poland, and people said, well, Poland has a pipeline and they would make the money. Well, no, somebody attacked the Polish pipeline that carries things. There was an attack on Polish territory. People say, well, that proves the Polish did it. I'm sorry, not on Polish territory, on Ukrainian territory. It's a pipeline that goes through Ukraine and Poland.
Mm-hmm.
But Spetsnaz can operate, Russian commandos can operate behind the lines. We don't know what happened there. Maybe the Ukrainians will have some proof, some video or something to prove it. So we don't know there either. So that argument, I don't know. But the Russians have the most to gain, because the Russians can claim they were attacked by America. The Russians can point to this to the German people and say, you're allied with these awful Americans who did this to you. See? And so notice he didn't blame NATO for it. He blamed the Anglo-Saxons, meaning the British and the Americans, but he's aiming to alienate the Germans from us. So it's a boon to him. because to a lot of people, it sounds credible that America did it because of the kind of anti-American propaganda that's so prevalent in America among conservatives and people on the far left. The left already thinks America's evil. They've been saying it for years, even though they run the country. And now the right is saying it. And so who's gonna disbelieve that America did it? So Russia reaps the harvest from this. Whoever did it. So did Russia have a motive? Oh yeah, because they could claim they were attacked by us. But does that mean they did it? It would have been clever if they did, but it doesn't. We don't have any proof. We don't know. So I hope there's a way to prove it. The other thing, there's one other thought. There were American warships. I think it was a Marine assault ship passed over that area. So I would ask you this question. Would America have blown those pipelines with American warships in the vicinity? Would we be, I mean, we're stupid, but are we that stupid?
I don't know. The jury is out on that. We have to wait for whatever evidence piles up.
We have to wait
I
for
would hope
evidence.
we're not stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the plausible actors, I mean, it's a crapshoot. It could be, there's a possibility it could be the Russians, a possibility it could be the Americans. I mean, look, you and I disagreed with the assassination of General Soleimani. I mean, not that I particularly cared for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're supporters of terrorism, and they're an enemy of the United States, an institution that's part of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But there are things you and I, agree with on that. I have soured on neoconservatives type of interventionism for a long time. I was actually very glad, I think you may agree with me on this, when Trump fired John Bolton and John Bolton wanted to go into Iran. And we see what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. We just don't know how that's going to pan out. We predicted that it would be a cakewalk. And it turns out we were bogged down in counterinsurgency warfare that costs a lot of life and treasure, both Arab and American and coalition partners. So I don't know. Might even be Ukraine, although that would be kind of rash of them to do that.
Yeah,
and
that would be too. Yeah, Ukraine. Look, Ukraine.
Do they even have the infrastructure to do that? Their intelligence service.
Yeah, Ukraine doesn't have a navy in the Baltic Sea, so they don't have any submarines.
I'm
Whoever
saying
did it,
special troops maybe, but probably
no,
not.
no. It's an underwater job,
Yeah,
and
true.
you would have to have done it from a submarine of some sort, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It has to be a submarine, and I don't think Ukraine has a functional submarine right now, so I don't think they could have done it. I mean, Poland's in the Baltic Sea, Germany's in the Baltic Sea. I don't, it will be interesting to see. I just don't see that.
It have to be. It could be British. It could be more than likely American. Being stupid.
Well, yeah, and the Russians are in the Baltic Sea, and we know they have a lot of submarine units in their different fleets, and they have a Baltic fleet. But there's one additional thought about that. Like I said, would we have done it with the ships in the area? And my guess is that somebody would have had those ships move away.
Yeah, that's true.
Done. I just have a feeling that I know our people. I think strategic thinking is not linear and it's not obvious, and so that's where our people fail. They fail at strategic, but the basic mathematical things like the visuals, because we're a TV-oriented society, I think we would get the visual part. At least I hope we're not that dumb. But that's, and then the fact that this attack happened in the very week that the referendum was going on. So if you think about it, they're having the referendum, the Russians are having the referendum in southeastern Ukraine. At the same time, this event happens, which has really good optics for the Russians. And then at the end of the week, Putin can make a speech and blame the Anglo-Saxons for it. So those are my points, but none of it is any proof. They're just sort of analytical points to keep in mind that, we don't know, but those are things that are, motive, opportunity, and stupidity. So,
before we get to China, what is the status of American trade sanctions and NATO trade sanctions on Russia? How comprehensive are they? I mean, Biden has made some steps regarding, of course, Russian oil bans, which I agree with, bans on Russian ammunition, and more crackdowns on certain Russian banking institutions. But how far-reaching really is this? Can you comment on that?
Look, it's very odd. I mean, I'm going to just throw out a few analytical points again. Um, why, normally when you when you have an embargo or a blockade on somebody, the intention is to damage their economy, to hurt them. But I think that it's pretty clear that most of the more severe damage in not receiving the raw materials from Russia accrues to the West. To Great Britain, look at what's happened to the pound. To Germany, look what they're going to go through in winter, and many other European countries where rationing is coming into effect. Look, this is not, you're going to blockade yourself, excuse me. You're going to do this. Why? Russia's problem is morale, not resources. Um, they need certain inputs from us, like they need our chips and things that they need to put in their weapons. It's good they're not getting that, but we can deprive them of those chips without putting ourselves and our allies into such a difficult position. I don't know that that's wise. I need to think about it. I think it should have been thought about more. I think we go to sanctions as a knee-jerk way, but when you talk about really hurting Russia in a permanent financial way, you know that none of the countries, none of the companies, last I checked, on the New York Stock Exchange that are Russian have been expropriated or sanctioned. I mean, have you heard of any of them?
No, no, I have not. The most I've heard was in Germany with Rosneft's properties in
Yes.
eastern Germany.
Yeah,
I've
the
heard about
Germans.
that. Ironically, at one of their refineries in Leuna in eastern Germany was actually originally an East German refinery, oil refinery that refined Soviet and Arab ally oil. But anyways, yeah, I mean, the sanctions, there's a lot of loopholes. I think, and this is my general point, and you may agree or disagree. My issue is that when we start to sanction and embargo, look, I don't think we should trade with Russia or China or enemies of the United States as a matter of principle. And that's one thing that the West and the United States has severely damaged ourselves and made us extremely vulnerable. And it shows the hubris and the idiocy and the ideological myopia of our leadership. We need a national economic plan, a national strategy. There are a million strategy papers, Jeff. I have read them. You have read them. The Trump administration has issued several on this issue, but nothing is implemented. And we need a serious, and this is where, again, my ideological metamorphosis comes into play. You need a sort of quick decision making, get the job done, centralized government, and let's cut through crap. And we got to really start to undo a lot of the free trade agreements, and also change corporate governance, that everything is all about shareholder primacy and that's it, and not taking into account national security. And we need to do that before we can decouple from China and Russia. And that has been used in our history. You look at Alexander Hamilton's plans, his report on manufacturers, his report on national banking, that would create credit for these industries, which was used with success. And I think that's what we need to do. But our leaders, I mean, look, there's a lot of ideological and party-based tribal loyalty. You have what the late broadcaster Chuck Harder, many of our congressmen and senators and presidents belong to the I've Got Mine Club. They just care about themselves. They don't care about the country as a whole. And that's where your discourse on a war and the necessity of a warrior intellectual aristocracy comes into play. And I think that's an important point. So that's my point. I would, yes, sanction and denounce to a degree, but I would also do it gingerly, because we are way too vulnerable economically. You remember what Lenin and Stalin said in regard to the third world colonies. They're the rear of imperialism. They can cut those materials off. And that's what they're doing. The Putin government, some of their representatives have talked about using cutoffs of food and oil and fertilizers, and cutting them off from what they view as enemies of Russia, and with the intention of hurting them. So I think we have to rebuild the layers of power, industrial and military, in this United States, and civil defense before we can take a muscular policy. What are your thoughts about that? Because I am very scared of antagonizing very powerful countries.
Well, we've done a host of foolish things. For example, we allowed Chinese and Russian companies to come into our economy, to control companies. And I was talking to a Canadian earlier today who was saying that the Chinese were getting control of mines in Canada and pouring cement down the mines to seal them up. They would buy the mine just to seal it up, or the Russians would do the same thing. Why would they do that? So that we wouldn't have access to the resources in the mine. So, like with uranium one, what have the Russians done to American uranium mining? America uranium mining has been systematically shut down. So that the French, I got a email from a French friend in Paris this morning, and he said, our nuclear power industry is working at minus 40% capacity or something, because we can't get the uranium from Russia. And there's none. The U.S. used to produce uranium. Look, the uranium that was produced in Africa that used to be controlled by Europe is now controlled. Those countries are not colonies of Europe. They're colonies of China. They're communist countries now. The uranium that made the first two atomic bombs was from a uranium mine in the Congo. That the uranium in that mine is now going to North Korea. It's going to Kim Jong-un. So it's like, how will we have nuclear power? How will we have nuclear weapons if they have basically thrown, flooded our uranium mines or thrown cement down them, and, because we let them buy into our mines, and then they have monopolized the uranium production across the planet? Is that a plan? Yeah, I think so, dummies. It's a plan.
Well, strategically, it makes sense. Again, it talks about rear of imperialism. You read Putin's speech. You discussed it. I'm glad you did. He is a creature of the Soviet system and Soviet culture. They're going to learn this in the KGB institutes. He's going to learn this. You're going to learn this in training. Prove me wrong. It strategically makes sense. I would do the same thing too. Put yourself in your shoes. You like to say you put yourselves in the shoes of a Russian or Chinese strategist. I try to do the same thing. What makes sense? What are the weaknesses of the West? It's like in business. The SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's the same thing. I don't believe we use it comprehensively, because I think we have a tremendous hubris. I think we think it's 1945 and that we're invincible. And unfortunately, I have very bad news. As much as, yes, you have Russian desertions, as widely reported in TV and print media, there's a lot of strengths that Russia does have that they're not using. And believe me, they're more self-sustaining economically than we are.
Yeah, the Russians have probably one of the most autarkic economies. And the Soviet Union partly cultivated that. The Russian Federation kind of maintained elements of that. And they have tremendous, because of the size of their country, with 11 time zones, they have more natural resources in their country than just about any other country in the world. And so that makes them able to do some things that others can't do. China has real problems in this regard. They're not energy sufficient. They have certain minerals, but they lack many things in China that they need. So, but Russia is a rather remarkable country in that regard.
So at this point, what would you do if you're a president's national security advisor at this point? Jeff, you're not a neoconservative. You're not a hyper-interventionist. You're a strategic thinker. You have no illusions of the Russian Federation and its intentions. And let me make this clear for the audience. I mean, again, you have Putin Dmitry Medvedev, recently this year talked about a Eurasian Union or Eurasian Europe stretching from Vladivostok all the way to Lisbon. I mean, come on, guys. Come on, bro. What is that about? That's not about just protecting the motherland. And look, I sympathize with a true Russian nationalism. I think Russia should be truly independent. It should be a powerful country, but it should be thoroughly free from the American strategic viewpoint of Soviet structures and Soviet political culture that's there. And that is the problem. And when you have leaders talking about recently, talk about re-annexing Alaska, we want it back, we want a Eurasian Europe stretching from Vladivostok to Lisbon, that's a major direct challenge ultimately to the sovereignty of the United States as far as I'm concerned. So
well,
what would you do?
A Eurasian empire that they're, a number of their officials have talked about this, and Alexander Dugin's whole thing is about this Eurasianism. Look, first thing I would tell Biden is resign. Do yourself
I'm not
a
talking
favor in
about
the country.
Biden. What would you do for an American president? That's why I left today.
Look, you don't want to start a nuclear war, and you don't want to do something that they will blame you for one, although they'll blame you for one no matter what you do. So you have to keep that in mind. Look, the West, I don't understand the mentality of a lot of conservatives now. I think they're just alienated and they think their own government is the enemy because there's left-wingers and Marxists in their government. Of course, that's not all there is in their government, but those are there and they get elected. And they, of course, lie about who they are and deceive the people. Same thing in Germany, but there are good people on the left. There are patriotic people who you and I might not agree with, or I might not agree with, but not everybody is bad. And you have to bring your country together. You have to seek unity because you can't turn your country into a bloodbath. That's not an option because everybody doesn't agree with me, right? Me. That's what they want everyone. No, politics is about getting along with other people. Now it's really hard and we're really disintegrated and so on. But what I would say is that in terms of survival, you have to have a strategy of unifying people. You have to have clarity and you have to orient people to the enemy. And you have to orient to them the fact that there is this communist bloc and that's what Russia really is. You look at, even Macron said something remarkable in an interview recently, which I found amazing. He said that, the only people supporting this annexation are communist countries. Wow, President Macron. That's amazing. That's right. It's Cuba, it's North Korea, it's
Venezuela is openly.
Yeah.
China, I mean, even though China claims they're neutral, the media has
nonsense.
been totally in Russia's corner. You look at, Vietnam, they're calling the people on the street that are loyal communists, according to even the New York Times, are calling him Uncle Putin. Mm-hmm. And so, you look at that Burma. Yeah. Which has long been an ally of Myanmar.
See a guy who claims to be for our great historic Russia, he lies. He lies and he's a pig. He's a murderous pig. That's what Putin is. And he lies. And they don't believe him, don't credit anything he says. If his lips are moving, he's lying. He is not a great Russian. He does not care about Russia. Look at what he's doing to the Russian nation. Look at what he's doing to the Russian people. He is damaging Russia. Russia is being damaged by this war. And the brotherly love that existed between Ukrainians and Russians is being torn apart. This is a civil war between the former Soviet countries. You could call it a Soviet civil war. It's a war of independence for the Ukrainian people who no longer want to be under this murderous Moscow regime. And he's putting the communist Soviet Union back together in little pieces very deceptively, very dishonestly. And his alliance with China is a big giveaway. China is ruled by the Communist Party of China. And so it is, look, if I were advising, I would say We need to build nuclear weapons. We need these new warheads. We need to get warheads yesterday. And we have to create our deterrent. We have to get civil defense. We have to get a ballistic missile defense, and we have to do it as fast as we can. And we have to put the idea of their nuclear supremacy in doubt, because they can't win a conventional war. We see this in Ukraine. And this is something military analysts have known for a long time. The Soviet Union and China are not countries that can win conventional wars against the West.
Well, they would need to do a decapitating strike first, which has always been in their strategies for decades, is a decapitating weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, for example, attack, and then they can move in with their troops.
Yeah, well, they tried a decapitating strike, by the way, in the Ukraine war. They immediately went after the capital, surrounded it, dropped paratroops behind it, and tried to kill the government.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a conventional decapitating strike.
I'm saying they would need to use nuclear or something.
And well, to reach out and destroy America. And it's look, I would move the capital and its business to Colorado.
Yeah.
I would not have the capital city of the United States on the East Coast, where a Russian missile, a seaborne missile, could reach it in 4 minutes and destroy it without anybody even being able to get warning and take shelter. Why would you have your national capital on the coast in an age of strike weapons coming out of submarines that can't be detected under the water? I'm sorry.
Well, they probably assume, I'm sure there's this lingering assumption that we can't win a nuclear war. As horrible as a nuclear war is and devastating, there is the belief in Russia and the Soviets that they can win the nuclear war. I've read the text of Florida Atlantic University Library. It's like on the top floor, and it's translated into English. And they talk about that, the various military officers that have talked about it in the Soviet times. And that literature is still being taught, from what I understand.
Well, and that literature was largely the Soviets, Marshal Sokolovsky and his team of writers. They used the philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, to help understand this, because Clausewitz said, war is a contest of wills. Right? It is for me to make you cry uncle before I do. Right? So if I can inflict enough pain on you and break your spirit, break your will, then you go, okay, I give up. I'll do what you want. That's what war is about. Okay? So you look at nuclear weapons. Look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese were ready to commit national suicide to defend themselves. That would have been a catastrophe for Japan. We nuked 2 cities, and they were willing to actually surrender on terms as long as the emperor stayed. They didn't surrender on unconditional surrender, but we gave them those terms, and the emperor remains to this day. They have an emperor in Japan, but it's very important to realize that nuclear weapons and being stabbed in the back by the Soviet Union, by the way, in Manchuria, changed their mind and made them come to terms with us. So there are it is spiritual and psychological, but Clausewitz said one of the key ways, usually you don't break anybody without a bloody encounter, a battle, usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Massive bloodshed will change people's minds. It's like, okay, this is too much. I give up, right? Every army, you look at all the battles, you look at the classic battles during the Napoleonic period, the Battle of Waterloo. Massive bloodshed, cavalry, dead horses, cavalry charges, dead horses, artillery slamming through formations of men. And finally, one side just dropped their weapons and run. In that case, it was the French. They just dropped their weapons and run as the old guard got shot down because they'd rather die in place than run. So basically, they just, that's what happens. One side loses heart and gives up. How much damage? We don't know. We don't know. It's a mystery. So nuclear war, is it winnable? Yeah, because you can damage somebody so much, they'll say, I give up. Here's the white flag. You bombed how many cities? You bombed 100 American cities, 5 American cities, 1 American city. Some Chinese generals like to think, oh, we'll bomb 1 American city and they'll surrender. The Americans are weak. I don't think we're that weak. I think that there's some of the really good Soviet analysts from the 1970s were right in saying that America would really fight very tough and survive very heavy bombardment.
But don't you think American culture and the American landscape has changed since the 1970s? And do you think perhaps the views of the Soviet analysts from the 1970s may have evolved and changed? I mean, I think we're very different than the 1970s. Even in the 1970s, we were having divisions with the so-called anti-war movement and whatnot, pushing us out of Vietnam, which, Colonel Luna revealed and many other defectors revealed that it was a massive victory. Pacheco, who participated in that and has written in book and disinformation, has also talked about how Andropov and Ceausescu, who participated in funding and controlling these anti-war movements, viewed it as a massive victory. I think things have changed. I think our national soul, to quote one book, has curdled badly.
Well, look, what I'll say is, look,
I'm a pessimist, I guess, in that way.
Americans are more, Americans are more neurotic. They're maybe more flabby. They're Americans maybe are more narcissistic. I think there's data on that, but they're still Americans, and that is you have this underlying tradition or culture, however attenuated it has been in recent years, and poisoned by leftist ideas, by some of this political correctness and gender disorder. I think that you're going to find that there is something that's retained that can be that can come back. I don't know whether we've gone too far in one direction for it to come back, but I think it can. And I think that it is war, and especially the more traumatic, the more destructive, the more bloody, it can create a change. But again, all of these psychological and spiritual factors are hard to predict because you don't know. You take a person in boot camp. And I remember when I went through boot camp, and you look at these guys, and you go, okay, who is going to make it through and who isn't? So it's Marine Corps boot camp, or whether it's the Navy SEALs or whatever, who's going to make it? You cannot always tell who is the weak one, who is going to, I remember one guy in my platoon, he seemed like the biggest mama's boy in the world. And he turned out to be, the guy fell off the rope on the day maneuver course and broke his leg, and he did a 3-mile run with a broken leg. And then he did the obstacle course, or the agility course, sorry. And he was the first guy to graduate from that Marine Corps training camp since the Vietnam War. That was in the later 70s. And it's like, I would have thought, he's that tough? Oh my gosh, everybody was like, he got his own salute from the colonel, from the commander of the training detachment on graduation day. He went by him on crutches. And because so you don't know what's in a person or in a country.
Mm-hmm. Right? Fair enough, it's true.
Yeah, you don't know. I would not sell America short. I had this conversation with Colonel Lunev, maybe about 19, 20 years ago. And Lunev said to me, oh, no, the Americans, he thought then that America was a lot tougher than anybody understood. And he was saying this as a tough Russian. He was a very tough man. And Russians are very tough people. They really are. They are tough people. And by the way, the proof of, people say, oh, there are all these Russians, they're draft dodging. Do you realize how tough you have to be to stand up to the Russian government? All those protesters, 1,400 arrested as of 3-4 days ago. I'm sure it's really, the real number is much higher than that. But to stand up to that government, they got people like Navalny, who was poisoned with Novichok, and he went back to Russia. So Russian people are amazing and tough people. And the fact that they're standing up to the government, and there's before I go, because I have to go pretty soon, we should talk about the weakening of Putin's regime.
Yeah,
which is,
why don't we wrap up on that point, please?
yeah, this is interesting. Chechnya, which is under Mr. Kadyrov, is saying, we've already sent our quota of troops to Ukraine, so we're not sending any more, and he's husbanding his own troops to stay at home, probably because he's kind of afraid for his own neck. And then in Dagestan, violent anti-draft protests in Dagestan, where over 300 have been killed. And that's just, I believe that's just adjoins Chechnya there in southern Russia. And really the local governor has stood up to Moscow saying, we're not going to do any drafts. Dagestan's not going to do it. And you've got the Armenians, saying, oh, we don't want Russia to defend us. Maybe we want America or someone else to defend us against the Azerbaijanis. And the Georgians are related to the Russians, have been part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union for a long time. That their leading party there in Georgia has called for a referendum. I haven't heard they've actually going to go ahead with it, but he called for a referendum to have a vote about opening a second front against Russia to take Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia back from the Russians. It's like is this everybody piling on? And then you look at the mood in Russia and hundreds of thousands fleeing, and them closing off the border. And then in Kazakhstan, Mr. Takiyev, the successor to Nursultan Nazarbayev, who's supposedly a Putin guy, right? Takiyev, the president of Kazakhstan, saying, oh, we're not going to hand over the Russian draft dodgers, the almost 100,000 in our country. We're keeping them safe here. We're going to take care of them. It's a humanitarian thing. And basically giving the finger to Putin, and there's Russian troops, actual Russian troops in Kazakhstan guarding like the Cosmodrome there and the airfield, stuff that's like Russian property there in Kazakhstan. And Russia has ordered those troops to be sent to the front in Ukraine, and those troops are refusing. And the Kazakhstan government is like, good for you. So you know what? These are cracks, and you can almost take Moscow's temperature from this. There's trouble in this regime. There's trouble.
The question is I'll leave you on this point, what is Putin going to do next? Because I've seen the footage of those demonstrations within the Russian Federation, and it is incredible and impressive. Will it force the government out of power and the Soviet structures out of power? We don't know.
Yeah,
but
there's no.
The Russians have been very brave at times in resisting tyranny.
Yes.
And hats off to them in that respect. From the early days of Lenin and obviously the Tsar, then Lenin, you had mass labor strikes. You had a Jewish woman revolutionary, Fanya Kaplan, who tried to assassinate Lenin. You have a lot of tradition in Russia, both the empire, the Soviet Union, and now the quasi-Soviet style Russian Federation. You have a lot of resistance, and let's hope maybe somehow it can put Russia back in its box, and where a truly nationalist, strong Russia can emerge that's free of Soviet structures and aggressive intentions against the West and the United States. Jeff, any concluding remarks before you leave?
Well, yeah, I would just add to what you just said and say, right now it doesn't look like the regime is in immediate danger. But if the trends continue, and if Putin makes another mistake, and this is my last point, I don't think, just as I say, the West has made strategic mistakes. The Russians do a lot of brilliant things strategically, and they maneuver quite well, but they are starting to make mistakes. And I think that they are pushing something. They think they know where they're going, and it may be an attack on the United States that we're looking at. The China and Russia are mobilizing at the same time, talking about war, and it may not be about Ukraine and Taiwan. It may be about North America. But the rest of the world is saying the rest of the world will just fall into line if we destroy those Americans. That might be what it is. But I think from what we've seen, I don't think they can make it work. They can kill a lot of people. They could overrun a lot of territory. They can do a lot of damage, but in the end, from what I've seen, they don't have the depth, the insight. They don't have the moral quality of a winner. And so I don't think they can win.
Well, and let's hope you're right. Let's hope whatever your stance is on our involvement in Ukraine, we all can agree that we want a truly free and independent Ukraine, and hopefully a cessation of the conflict, and also the Russian government to truly decommunize itself and free itself of Soviet structures and Soviet culture.
Yeah.
And Jeff, thank you always for coming on the show. Always great analysis, great points, a lot of experience you have. And we'll have you back on. You're going to also, folks, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, Jeff will be dropping an article on these subjects on Jared Nyquist's blog. Make sure you read it. Make sure you monitor his blog. Make sure you feel free to comment, just as long as you keep your comments respectful. And again, check out Jeff's blog, Jared Nyquist blog. Check out Jeff's books, Amazon.com. Just type in J.R. Nyquist. You get all of his books. You can purchase them. They're great reads, well written, scholarly, and well reasoned. Jeff, thank you so much as always. And prayers for the victims of, again, Hurricane Ian. It was a bad one. And we pray for the lost lives, the damaged people with damaged properties, damaged businesses, and just, a lot of despair and stress. So thank you all again. God bless. Be safe and take care.